And he had been talking about America, and he wanted an America like with families like the Waltons. He talked about it.
What if the most painful goodbye was the one that never actually happened? In 1970s America, the Waltons wasn't just a show, it was home. And at its heart were two faces millions fell in love with, a son with a dream and the mother who always believed in him. But off-screen, something quietly shattered. Richard Thomas, known to millions as John Boy Walton, was always forthcoming with his fans, open and gracious about his life and career. Yet, for decades, there was one deeply personal truth he never revealed. Not to his co-stars, not even to Michael Learned, who played his mother on the Waltons and became one of the most important people in his life. The story of what he withheld and how it eventually came to light is one that touched fans deeply and added a poignant layer to the legacy of one of television's most beloved families. When the Waltons premiered in 1972, it offered something refreshingly different. A show built on emotional truth, warmth, and moral integrity. Audiences were introduced not just to a fictional family, but to something that felt incredibly real, anchored by the bond between a young writer, John Boy, and his resilient mother, Olivia. Richard Thomas and Michael Learned didn't just portray those roles, they inhabited them. On screen, they embodied familial love. Off-screen, they developed a connection that defied easy categorization. She was a mother of three in real life, mature and grounded. He was just starting out, bright-eyed and thoughtful. Their connection wasn't romantic or forced. It was quiet, honest, and deeply emotional. They spent countless hours on set together, sharing long conversations and moments of thoughtful silence. Between camera setups and rehearsal breaks, they sat side by side, talking about life, books, family, and emotional toll of Hollywood. There was a natural ease to their companionship, so evident that crew members even had a nickname for them, a recognition that if one was around, the other was surely close by. This bond translated powerfully on screen. The intensity of John Boy's love for his mother, the deep well of emotion in Olivia's encouragement of her son. It was more than just performance. It was rooted in their real affection for each other. Viewers felt it, and it became one of the emotional pillars of the Waltons. For audiences navigating the cultural shifts of the 1970s, the emotional honesty of the show was like a balm, a return to timeless values and the strength of family. But behind the scenes, change was coming. As the Waltons found success, Richard Thomas's star began to rise. Major film roles came his way, offering artistic opportunities and broader recognition. He had earned this through his work as John Boy. But as new doors opened, he was faced with a dilemma. Embracing the future meant leaving something behind, not just a show, but the people he had grown so close to, especially Michael. Though he trusted her and valued her presence in his life, Richard kept his inner conflict to himself. He didn't tell her about the film offers or the decision he was weighing. Whether out of fear, guilt, or simply emotional avoidance, he said nothing. Not to Michael, not to producers, not to his co-stars. And while the reasons may have seemed valid to a young man on the brink of a big career move, years later, Richard would admit this silence was a mistake. When you love someone like family, silence doesn't spare them pain. It leaves them with questions, with wounds that time doesn't easily heal. By season 5, Richard had become more than just the show's narrator. He was at heart. His departure wasn't just a casting change. It altered the show's emotional core. Yet he still didn't speak to Michael about it directly. He didn't offer her a chance to respond, to support him, or simply say goodbye. She didn't hear the news from him, but from producers and whispers on the lot. And though Michael never expressed public resentment or spoke ill of Richard, the unspoken pain lingered. In interviews, she would sometimes pause when his name came up, a subtle shift in tone that said everything she didn't. Despite the professionalism she maintained, those who worked with Michael noticed a change after Richard left. She was as committed and graceful as ever, but a quiet ache seemed to follow her. She continued through season 7, holding the show together, but something was missing, not just on screen, but within her. Still, she never blamed Richard publicly. In fact, she continued to praise him, calling him talented, brilliant, and deserving of everything he achieved. But the truth was that the conversation that should have happened, the goodbye that never came, left a mark. After Richard's departure, the Waltons carried on. Another actor stepped into the role of John Boy, and the narrative continued, but the chemistry, the emotional thread that bound Olivia to her son, was never quite the same. Viewers felt it. The show still resonated, but something vital had shifted. And for many, that change was tied directly to the unspoken goodbye between Richard and Michael. Decades passed. Richard went on to have a respected, varied career. He rarely spoke about his exit from the Waltons or the silence between him and Michael. But those closest to him said the weight of that silence lingered. It wasn't regret over the choice itself. It was regret over how he handled it. And then years later, something unexpected happened. At a reunion event celebrating the Waltons, the cast reunited for a panel discussion. Among them were Richard and Michael, seated next to each other once again. Time had softened them both, but the connection remained. At first, the conversation was lighthearted, memories, behind-the-scenes anecdotes, laughter. But then a fan asked a question that shifted the mood. "Did you ever talk about how he left the show?" A pause followed. The room fell quiet. Richard glanced at Michael and chose to answer honestly. He admitted there were things he wished he had done differently. That leaving without a proper goodbye had haunted him in ways he hadn't expected. He spoke simply, without excuses or dramatics. Michael didn't respond with a speech. Instead, she placed her hand gently on his and nodded. That quiet gesture spoke volumes. In that moment, the silence that had lasted so long between them dissolved. What followed was a slow, steady reconnection. They participated in interviews, documentaries, and anniversary retrospectives together. The familiar rhythm between them returned. Not just nostalgia, but something genuine, a bond reignited, softened by age, distance, and healing. In one interview, Michael reflected on those early days on set. She shared how much he had learned from Richard, even though he was younger, how intuitive and present he had always been, especially in their shared scenes. Her words carried no bitterness, only warmth. Richard, too, spoke with reverence. He acknowledged how much he had admired Michael, not just as an actress, but as a person, her grace, her strength, the emotional leadership she brought to the show. He didn't try to rewrite the past. He didn't deny his misstep. Instead, he embraced the truth, that there were conversations he should have had, and that not saying goodbye to Michael properly was something he would always carry. For fans, their public reconnection brought long-awaited closure. When John Boy had left the show, audiences had felt the rupture, the gap in the heart of the series. Now, all these years later, they were witnessing that emotional arc come full circle. And what made it all the more profound was how understated it was. No grand gestures or scripted moments. Just two people quietly choosing to see each other again. It reminded viewers why they had connected so deeply with the Waltons in the first place. Because at its core, it wasn't just a story about a family. It was a story about relationships and the way they evolve, falter, and, if we're lucky, heal. As the years went on, both Richard and Michael continued to speak with affection about one another. Michael described Richard as one of the most emotionally attuned actors she had ever worked with. Richard, in turn, never forgot the grounding presence Michael had provided during those formative years. She wasn't just a co-star. She was a guide, a protector, a surrogate mother in every sense but blood. And even though he left without saying what needed to be said, life had eventually given him the chance to close that chapter with grace. Not through apology, but through truth. Ultimately, what remained between Richard Thomas and Michael Learn was never broken. It had simply gone quiet. And when they found each other again, what they rekindled wasn't just friendship or camaraderie, but something deeper, a shared history, an unshakable bond. Their story reminds us that silence can wound, but honesty, even delayed, can heal. That goodbyes matter. That sometimes closure doesn't come when we want it to, but it can still come gently with time. And for fans who had held the Waltons close for so many years, this reunion between John Boy and Olivia offered a kind of peace, a moment of truth that transcended the screen, reminding everyone that the ties of love, whether fictional or real, may fray, but they rarely disappear. With a touch, a glance, and a few honest words, Richard Thomas and Michael Learn didn't just reconcile a decades-old silence. They honored it, and in doing so, they gave their fans and each other the goodbye they had always deserved. What made this story resonate so deeply with fans, even decades later, was not simply nostalgia or a yearning for the past. It was the authenticity of the relationship between Richard Thomas and Michael learned, both on and off screen. In a television era often filled with formulaic dramas and surface-level sentiment, the Waltons stood apart for its emotional realism. The bond between John Boy and Olivia Walton wasn't just well-written. It was lived, felt, and shared by the actors playing those roles. That kind of emotional transparency, that quiet sincerity, is what made their eventual estrangement and reconciliation so profoundly moving. In Hollywood, where careers often require abrupt departures, the unspoken goodbye between Richard and Michael wasn't unique. But what made their story stand out was the emotional intimacy that had been disrupted by it. Michael wasn't just a co-worker. She had become a surrogate figure in Richard's life, someone he trusted, leaned on, and admired. And yet, when the time came for him to leave, he withheld the one thing that would have made all the difference: his honesty. His silence wasn't meant to hurt her, but it did. And what stayed with him, perhaps more than he expected, was a knowledge that in trying to spare her pain, he created a different kind of wound. A wound made not by words, but by the absence of them. It's easy to assume that once actors leave a show, their connections dissolve as naturally as their contract expire. But that's not how it was with the Waltons. The set wasn't just a workplace. It was a world built on trust, respect, and emotional investment. The cast had formed real relationships, enduring ones, and for Richard and Michael, their bond wasn't something that could be turned off with the cameras. That's why his departure and the way he left an echo, not just in the scripts or among the cast, but deep within them. Michael, for her part, never lashed out. She didn't demand apologies or air grievances. That was never her style. But in her quiet moments, in interviews where her words trailed off or her eyes shifted ever so slightly, you could see what wasn't being said. She had waited for him to say goodbye. He hadn't, and it hurt. Yet, as time passed, she held on to the good, the love they shared, and the belief that one day he might acknowledge the silence between them. She didn't chase it. She simply carried it. Years turned into decades, and while their professional paths diverged, fans never stopped asking about them. The question, "Are you still close?" often followed Michael in interviews. And though she would smile and say kind things, there was always a sense that something had been left behind, not broken, but unfinished. Then came that reunion, that unexpected moment when time folded in on itself and brought them back to where it all started. Two people, once so close, were seated beside each other again, not as actors, but as people with shared past and an emotional debt to one another. That fan's question, so direct, so unexpected, became the catalyst for what had gone unsaid. Richard didn't deflect. He didn't hide. He simply told the truth. And in doing so, he gave, in many ways, their journey mirrors the very lessons the Waltons was built upon. That family, chosen or blood, isn't defined by perfection but by grace. That people make mistakes, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of immaturity. And that healing doesn't always require dramatic gestures. Sometimes it just requires presence, honesty, and time. What Richard and Michael gave to each other in those later years wasn't a rewrite of the past, but an affirmation of what had always been true, that their bond mattered and still did. Their reunion also gave fans something they hadn't realized they were waiting for. A kind of closure not just to the show, but to the emotional journey they had taken with these characters. Many viewers have felt the absence when John Boy left, not just because of the casting change, but because something deep had gone unresolved. Now, watching Richard and Michael reconnect, they felt the story had finally been completed. It was healing not just for them, but for everyone who had ever watched that show and found comfort in its quiet truth. In later interviews, Richard often spoke about how formative that period had been in his life. He referred to Michael as one of the most important people he had worked with, not only because of her talent, but because of her kindness. And Michael, looking back, acknowledged that hearing those words, even years later, brought peace. It wasn't about reliving the past. It was about honoring it. In the end, their story is one of timing, grace, and emotional honesty, of how silence, when left too long, can grow into something unintentional yet painful, but also of how people, even after years of distance, can find their way back to each other. Richard and Michael's journey reminds us that real connections don't vanish. They wait. And sometimes, all it takes to close a chapter is a gentle hand, a shared look, and the courage to finally speak the truth. So if this story moved you or reminded you of someone you've been meaning to call, let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more true Hollywood moments that go deeper than headlines. And remember, behind the scripts and spotlights, the most powerful stories are always the human ones.